everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm Elizabeth Falter. I'm the digital media specialist in the Department of English, and I will serve as your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us for Book Club. Today, we will be discussing The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, selected by Department of English leaders and faculty. We are recording this webinar, and we will share the video along with additional resources with all of you via email. Attendees, you are muted and your video is off. If you have a comment or a question to add to the conversation, you can share by typing in the Q&A. To do so, just click Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit your comment or question. We already have 43 attendees on this webinar, so we will not be able to respond to every comment and question, but we will do our best to address as many as possible. A big thank you to Brian McHale, Arts and Humanities Distinguished Professor of English, and Jessie Schotter, Associate Professor in the Department of English, for sharing their expertise with us today. So Brian and Jessie will get us started with some opening remarks about The Great Gatsby, and we'll then open up the conversation to your questions and comments. Brian, take it away.
Okay, welcome everybody, wherever you are in space and time. I have to start by apologizing for my voice, which apparently has left me. I want to say a few things in my preliminary remarks about my love-hate relationship with The Great Gatsby, in hopes that it might resonate with some of you. The Great Gatsby is a book that I teach quite often, and consequently I reread it quite often. And it's one of those books where I think I know it really well, and I think I can just skim through it and reread the passages I underlined the last time, or read the pages that I put the Post-it notes in. And then about an hour or 2 hours later, I look up and I realize I've been rereading every word. So I must love it. It must engage me no matter what. On the other hand, I also resent it. I have the feeling that The Great Gatsby hogs the spotlight that could have been shared with many other equally valuable novels, certainly equally valuable American novels. I kind of resent the way it's universally acknowledged to be the great novel of the American dream. Really? I would think maybe Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a better candidate for the great novel of the American dream. And if we say, well, but that's a kind of special novel, right? It's the Black American dream, then I think we have to examine our expectations a little bit. It also hogs the spotlight for novels of the Jazz Age or novels of the Roaring Twenties. And here I'm particularly resentful because there are other excellent, wonderful books that emerge from that era. My favorite is Manhattan Transfer by John Dos Passos, which comes out in the same year of The Great Gatsby. And which, from a lot of perspectives, is a richer, stranger, more ambitious book, but it's barely read nowadays. And I kind of suspect that it's partly because Great Gatsby has elbowed it to one side. And even in F. Scott Fitzgerald's own corpus of novels, there's a case to be made that The Great Gatsby gets too much attention, and especially one other novel, not enough attention, and that's Tender is the Night, which again is a more ambitious, a stranger, in some ways an untidy book, but it's definitely eclipsed by Gatsby. So all right. There's my resentments. I'm tempted almost to say that, you know, we love Gatsby for the wrong reasons, but that can't be right. There's no such thing as loving a novel for the wrong reasons. Every reason for loving a novel is a good reason. What I might be able to get away with saying is that we teach Great Gatsby for the wrong reasons. And in particular, we teach it for its teachability. Which sounds like a paradox, but it isn't. This is a book that lends itself to the classroom. It's short, it's manageable. There's about a dozen named characters, of which only 6 or 7 are important, depending upon how you're counting. So you can keep track of it. It appears to be straightforward, beginning, middle, and end. That's partly a misapprehension, or more like a kind of sleight of hand on Fitzgerald's part. I'll come to that in a minute. It's, to say the least, got an engaging style. You can't help but find the language attractive. It's got an identifiable theme, the American dream, what I was just talking about. It's got legible symbols, the green light at the end of the dock, the eyes of T.J. Ecclesburg. It has some of the traces of the reprehensible attitudes of its own time. There are traces of racism and of anti-Semitism in the book, but in a sense, they're compensated for by the mockery of Tom Buchanan's reading in white supremacist literature. So it's eminently teachable, which is not necessarily a recommendation. It's a little too teachable. It offers a little too little resistance to our efforts to get our heads around it. What I especially value in Gatsby are the places in the book and the moves that Scott Fitzgerald makes that are a little more devious or crafty or tricky, that actually push back against our attempts to understand it too well or too quickly. So, for instance, there are actually very complicated displacements of the chronology of the story. In the beginning of chapter 6, we hear about Gatsby's backstory. But what we're actually hearing is what Nick Carraway will hear on the night after the accident in the future, which will give him knowledge of Gatsby's past. So it's actually a flashback inside of a flash forward. We don't necessarily grasp it that way as we're reading the book, but if you pause and try and figure out how this information comes to Nick Carraway and when, you realize how complicated the move is, right? Or the events at the service station, Wilson service station, in the night immediately after the accident, where at a certain point we flash back from a later point to the continuation of that scene at the service station. And more than that, we get information that violates the apparent rules of the game in this novel, which is to say all the information comes channeled through Nick Carraway. There's information there that Nick Carraway, apparently at first glance, can't know about what passed between Michaelis and Wilson at the garage. If you read carefully enough, if you squint a little bit, you see how Fitzgerald covers his tracks here and how he justifies this apparently excessive knowledge on Nick Carraway's part. But it's exactly the craftiness of setting this up and then hiding his tracks that I like about the book, and that it seems to me is the place where the book does push back against kind of overly glib readings or over accessibility. So that's where my love of the book is confirmed, and where my resentments of it are at least partly overcome. So I'll hand off now to Jesse.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I wanted to pick up on a few issues that Brian was talking about, both the kind of narrative aspects and sort of odd narrative aspects of the book, and also sort of trying to, again, read the novel, which is so familiar to a lot of people, against our kind of expected ways of reading it. As Brian said, right, this is often, called, right, the great American novel, and it's often taught or understood with a reference to that Americanness, right, equating Gatsby's dreams with the American dream. But large portions of it were written when Fitzgerald was not in America. He was on the French Riviera and in Rome. So I wanted to talk just briefly and sort of counterintuitively about the novel not as American, but as kind of existing beyond the nation and part of the larger movement of Anglo-American modernism. Because it's, I think, in British modernist writers that we can see a lot of the direct influences on the novel. So for me, that starts with Joseph Conrad. So much of the peculiar narrative strategies that Fitzgerald employs and that Brian has sort of mentioned have their roots in Conrad. Right. First off, we have the narration. Right. We get Nick Carraway as our narrator, but Nick, of course, is not the central figure of the novel. Right. He has his own struggles and desires, but he's here primarily to tell the story of Gatsby, who is the driver of the narrative. This is a structure that Conrad employs frequently, most notably in Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim, in which the narrator Marlowe tells the story of Kurtz and Jim, respectively. It's really their stories, but like Nick, Marlowe is their narrator. Or really, he's the inheritor of their stories. After their deaths, it's left to him to construct, interpret, and make sense of their experience, to pass it on, just as Nick does. And that necessity, I think, also accounts for some of the other odder narrative choices here. The fact that this is a story told retrospectively, one in which Nick has to arrange the materials of Gatsby's life into a form that makes sense, means that the narrative is told out of order. And as Brian mentioned, right, aspects of Gatsby's backstory are recounted to us before Nick has had an opportunity to learn them in the narrative. And other events aren't narrated at all. They're circled around or reconstructed from other sources. Gatsby's death, Myrtle Wilson's death, even the bulk of Gatsby and Daisy's first reunion scene are simply left out. As in Conrad, truth is not something that can kind of be immediately or unambiguously known, but must be searched out, inferred, and filled in. Thus, the latter chapters of Gatsby, like a lot of Conrad's novels, kind of take on the form of an inquest. We have a series of events that we don't get represented, the truth of which we don't fully know, and Nick has to reconstruct them from hints and witnesses, and ultimately his own interpretations. He has to construct a better alternative to the distorted, more public accounts in the newspapers. So if narrative structure is one thing that Fitzgerald derives from British modernism, I think he also grapples with other source texts in his treatment of modernity itself. In particular, like a lot of American fiction and poetry in the 1920s, Gatsby seems to be in the shadow of T.S. Eliot's long poem, The Wasteland. In particular, the Valley of Ashes, right, one of the central loci of symbolic meaning in the novel, seems like, in some ways, a kind of reincarnation of Eliot's poem, to the point that it's even referred to as a wasteland at one point. For Eliot, in that poem, modernity is desiccated, meaningless, atomized, and the only potential for meaning is in the fragments and scraps of the past. The poem is a kind of definitive rejection of modernity. And its focus on the retreat of sacred meaning is echoed in Fitzgerald's famous image of the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eichelberg, which very explicitly present a kind of debased version of spirituality, God reduced to the form of an advertisement. And interestingly, in a way that echoes a similar moment that equates religious meaning and advertisement from Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, where there's like an airplane skywriting. That's published in the same year as The Great Gatsby. So there are ways in which the novel kind of embraces Eliot's pessimistic, apocalyptic vision of the modern world and his nostalgia for a lost past. This is, of course, right, a profoundly nostalgic novel, or at least Gatsby is a profoundly nostalgic figure, right, seeking to go back to the past and impossibly recapture it. And at times the novel seems to agree with him. I think the image of trains is particularly important here. Gatsby, when he returns to Louisville in despair after losing Daisy the first time, he sees a trolley from out of his coach window when he's leaving. And in the last pages of the novel, Nick reminisces about the trains of his childhood that brought him back to the Midwest. Here, this older mode of transportation seems pure and better compared to the corruption of the East and of the contemporary world. And it's better, more specifically, than cars. Right? Cars are a much newer technology than trains, and they cause Myrtle Wilson's death. And not for nothing is the petrol station where she lives and where she's killed in close proximity to the Valley of Ashes, the symbol of this decay of meaning. Jordan Baker, who herself almost gets into a car accident, is even named for two car companies of the time. Yet it would be a mistake, I think, to see Fitzgerald as similarly condemning modernity and looking back to a lost, better past, because modernity and cars are just really exciting in the novel. There's a newfound sense of freedom and possibility that cars specifically and the whole modern world provide. Right? It may be corrupt, it may be rootless, it may be dangerous, but it's also pretty tantalizing. And what I think makes the novel so effective is how it's animated by this tension between the nostalgia for a pure past and an embrace of the possibilities of the present and future. Nowhere is this expressed better than in the famous final page, right? We get a vision of the lost possibilities of the past, the one that kind of tellingly denies America's settler colony origins when Fitzgerald invokes the fresh green breast of the new world. But that's balanced by Gatsby's forward-looking dream, his pursuit of the quote orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. And then, of course, that dream is undermined as we are borne back ceaselessly into the past in the final sentence. So on the final page, as throughout the novel, Fitzgerald's text is precariously balanced between past, present, and future. So that's all I have to say to start. I did want to just leave with a question. Obviously, I'm mostly interested in the questions you have to ask, but if people wanted to chime in the comments, what I've talked about sort of may perhaps help to explain some of the origins of the narrative structure, but it doesn't really address the more interesting questions about the novel, which is why Fitzgerald makes these kinds of narrative choices and what effect they had on you as you were reading the novel. So that's something you could chime in on in the comments if you'd like.
Thank you both so much. I will keep an eye on the Q&A. So anyone who wants to chime in to answer Jesse's question about the effects of the narrative structure on you as a reader, please feel free, and I'll read those out as they come in. But our first question comes from Scott, who asks, to what extent do the 1920s of the novel relate to the 2020s in America today?
I'll start, and Jesse, you take over when I peter out. I think the easiest way into that question is to note what Jesse was just talking about, the sort of sexiness of technology in The Great Gatsby, right? Those cars are absolutely erotic, and the sense of modernity, of that moment's modernity, 1920s, as being charged up with excitement and energy and the future-oriented direction of technological development in particular. I think that transfers to our time very neatly, right? It's, we're not impressed by cars anymore, though of course we are, right? A Tesla is really cool. But substituting our technologies, our cutting edge, for what was cutting edge to Fitzgerald, and substituting the kind of catastrophes that the technology of 1920s America help facilitate in the novel, I think we can extend that into our moment.
I mean, for me, what I was struck rereading this is the sort of the kind of both presence and absence of race here, right? The 20s as a time of a kind of rise of white supremacy, or sort of, I guess, overt white supremacy, and that being sort of echoed today as well. And, this is a novel in which like race is barely present, and it's weird, as Brian and I were talking about before, it's weird to write a novel of the Jazz Age in which it's all white people, and the few times when there are Black characters, they're often presented in sort of racist ways. But I was struck in rereading it this time that the whiteness of the characters is kind of remarked upon at various points. That Daisy talks about her like white girlhood. At a different point, Jordan says that sort of we're all white here. So it's not as if there's a kind of, it's not like whiteness is kind of invisible or unmarked here. I think Fitzgerald is taking pains to kind of call attention to the whiteness of these characters, even if he's not sort of able to represent Black characters or people of color. And I think that's often kind of typical of a lot of the sort of American writers of the 20s and the white American writers of the 20s and 30s, that there's a kind of a failure to represent people of color in their novels, but a kind of level of insight about the importance that race and racism play in American society. And that is actually kind of centered, even though in terms of their representations of people of color, those often fall pretty flat.
And Susan added a comment that relates to that, as well as what you were discussing earlier, Jesse, regarding modernity, which is retreat from modernity is fine for the privileged, but not so fine for the marginalized and subjugated. So she had added that when you were discussing that. All right. Brian, I think you were muted.
I'll learn how to do this eventually. Just for the record, by my account, there's only 2 encounters with African-American people in the whole novel. One of them is quite insulting, but Fitzgerald slightly recovers from it by drawing the conclusion. So this is when they're driving across the bridge into Manhattan, and he notices in the car beside him 2 Black men and a woman driving in, and they're rolling their eyes in rivalry with him. And the description is insulting. And then Nick Carraway draws the conclusion, when you cross this bridge, anything can happen. And that seems to me like just the slightest insight into the changes that are going on right in front of him, right? He isn't quite able to put his finger on it, but he goes, anything can happen, right? Maybe Black people will become cultural players. And then the other moment when a Black person figures in the novel is after the accident, a Black driver comes up to volunteer information about the car that passed him. And the cop immediately takes him aside to question him, which gives you a kind of chill up the spine, right? He's being a good citizen. He's volunteering information, and he's being interrogated. Why? Well, I think we can draw the conclusion.
Our next question comes from Barbara, who says, I always felt the novel was about human flaws. Can you please talk about this?
Jesse, you start.
I mean, there's ways in which I think the novel can be sort of mapped onto kind of like a tragic model, where we get a sort of classical tragic model where we get the kind of fatal flaw of a particular character, kind of hubris and stuff. And I think that, as well, is another reason why it works so well teaching it in high school, as I've taught it many times when I taught high school. Because it does correspond to these kinds of frameworks that sort of account for its sort of sustained popularity, I think. I've always been, I guess, a little bit less interested in the kind of flaw aspect of this. Certainly, right, Gatsby has these kind of grandiose dreams that don't come to fruition. But I don't know, I think what the strength of the novel is that there's not a kind of clear flaw that you can kind of point to. There's just a kind of combination of external circumstances and a variety of flaws that Gatsby might possess that might account for this. And part of the feel is, it's something both inherent to Gatsby's character, but also that Gatsby has kind of bought into the kind of societal sort of expectations around him, and that itself, right? So it's not something necessarily inherent to him, but it's also inherent to society that sort of leads to this kind of bad end for him.
And just two words about Nick Carraway's flaws, the narrator. As we all should know, when a narrator says, "I'm the most honest person I know," red lights should flash, and we have to assume that Fitzgerald is gesturing behind Nick Carraway's back. And the closer you look at it, the more dishonest in crucial ways Nick Carraway is. He aids and abets adultery between Gatsby and Daisy. He is guilty of obstruction of justice. He knows what happened in the accident, and he doesn't tell anybody. I think that's flawed.
And Alan actually posed a question related to that, which is asking if Nick is the ultimate villain, given his knowledge of Myrtle's death and Gatsby's death and the cover up by Tom and Daisy.
I mean, the novel so clearly has like Tom Buchanan as the villain. He's like it's just such a reprehensible guy in every way, right? That there clearly is a kind of villain, but the way in which, right, as Brian was talking about, right, the novel also kind of masks the way in which Nick is kind of also implicated in all of these things, and I feel like Nick, to a certain extent, self-servingly, like also sees himself as like an outsider, sort of visiting this kind of world, but that he's not really a part of. In this way, it's similar to Gatsby. But I also found it odd that right at the end of the novel, he sort of treats all the characters as if they're outsiders, right? They're Midwesterners coming to the East and they don't really fit. And that sort of, I feel like, breaks down the kind of sense of like, oh, these are the kind of wealthy, corrupt people in the East that I'm visiting versus me, and I'm kind of standing partially outside of that as well. Right, by sort of lumping these all together, I think there's Nick doesn't seem to sort of acknowledge this directly, but there's a sense in which he is maybe the same as the sort of corruption that surrounds him.
If we learned anything from modernism, it's don't trust narrators.
So just to remind everyone, if you have questions or comments, feel free to add them by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and typing your question or comment. And Susan added a comment, I believe, related to the discussion of the race in the Great Gatsby, and notes that even in terms of marginalized groups, even the portrait of women is interesting. Jordan is the only woman who seems to have much agency, Susan noted.
That's another of the indications of this book's fascination with modernism, right? The idea of the female athlete is cutting edge in the 1920s, right? This is a modern development, and the fact that Jordan Baker has exactly that identity is part of that cutting edge of a modern experience.
I mean, it seems, particularly in Jordan's character, who's so interesting, it seems sort of caught between sort of conceptions, sort of like a new woman conception and a kind of older just even more patriarchal system, right? She is this sort of athlete and independent woman. On the other hand, she has like chaperones taking her around places, and she's living with her aunt. Like, she's not living sort of on her own. She's not really necessarily free to go to parties on her own, and yet she seems to live like this kind of fairly liberated life and have this relationship with Nick. And there's a kind of interesting tension there in terms of the ability to sort of live independently, and the ability to have a kind of freedom for women that gets expressed in the novel through her character.
So our next question is from David, and actually also relates back to the 1920s versus 2020s question. And David has brought up the question, comparing 1920s to the 2020s, what about income inequality and affordable housing and those elements of the novel?
Well, I think what's crucial here is their invisibility, the invisibility of those issues in this novel. The invisibility speaks volumes, right? This is not what Nick Carraway notices. And it's not the world that Gatsby and Daisy and Tom move in, right? We have a glimpse of the way the other half lives in the Wilsons and their failing service station and Myrtle's aspirations to something better. But out on Long Island, we see nothing of the way other people live. Even when we're in Manhattan, in the thick of the big city, an era of Harlem Renaissance and mass immigration, we get no inkling of the way the other half lives. I'm exaggerating a little bit. There's the guy who's selling the dogs on the street, who must have a backstory, right? But you would be hard pressed to come up with very many others.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? On one level, right, this is a kind of satire of the wealthy, right? It is making fun and critiquing the kind of absurdities of the Gatsby's parties and the sort of moral corruption of the rich, and the sort of the people that Fitzgerald is sort of moving among, at least to a certain extent. But as Ryan says, right, there's not much representation of other sorts of characters, right? We do get them in the Wilsons as well. I always love this like very pretty passage that is like, in the metropolitan twilight, I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes and felt it in others, poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows, waiting until it's time for a solitary restaurant dinner, young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. There's like just a sort of really beautiful evocation of characters who are from a different social class, but there's also a real, I feel like in that passage, Nick is trying to sort of see himself as like those people, but that kind of ignores the extent to which Nick, is like a bond trader or whatever, and is definitely not part of this this life. And so I think it's a measure of both the kind of, it's obviously kind of attempting a critique of the inequalities of the era, but the vantage point of that critique is someone who like lives in a small house next to the big mansion, so is coming from a pretty large place of privilege, just not quite as privileged as the characters that surround him.
We should probably add here Gatsby's backstory, right? He does come from the other side of the tracks, and when his father turns up at the end, it's as though from another planet, right? A completely different social milieu, and that's the other world. It's not the world that Nick Carraway grew up in, for sure, but it's important for us to understand that it is the world that Gatsby grew up in.
So Susan, our next question comes from Susan, who says, the language is beautiful. And to me, that is what merits most in the book, not so much the story. Can you say more about that? So I guess about the beauty of the language over maybe the story.
I mean, I feel like in terms of tying it into modernism, right, there's a way in which, right, modernist novels make you notice the language, right? They make you notice the stylistic features, they make you notice the narrative construction, right? And so, yeah, there is like a lot of this sort of like very grand lyricism at particular moments here that's very kind of memorable and really kind of stands out to readers, I think. What's interesting, I think, what also makes Gatsby popular is that like it's also got a really absorbing plot. Like it's hard to put down. And so that balance between the kind of the sort of interest of it and the kind of appeal of it on a kind of formal and stylistic level, as well as just the kind of basic, not that they're worse, just as good appeal of plot, I think is also what's interesting about it.
It's pretty clear, Fitzgerald was steeped in poetry, and he brings poetry to this book, and some of it is quite traditional rhetorical modes of poetry, and some of it is quite modernist. There's that leapt off the page to me this time. There's that moment in one of the parties when a woman, a wife or girlfriend, is angry with her guy because he's flirting with another woman, and she hisses in his ear like an angry diamond. And you go, angry diamond? Wow, where did that come from? You could say, it comes from modernism. That's the sort of language you might expect from a modernist poet. He can do that, and then he can also do grand romantic passages like that last page, which is, echoes an older form of poetry, but still draws us in.
Now, a related comment, Alan comments, isn't one of the book's great virtues its economy? There isn't a wasted sentence. To me, this is quintessential American, as in American folk music, when a 400-verse British folk song is cut to 5 essential ones. Gatsby exemplifies essentialism. Dos Passos is a big contrast.
Yeah, well, totally about Dos Passos, right? That's not his method. Okay, I buy that. Economy is one of the virtues of this book, for sure. Though you don't want to overplay this, because there are some moments where clearly Fitzgerald is just playing. There's that list of the guests at Gatsby's parties, which is, extravagant comedy and satire. Not particularly functional, right? But Fitzgerald clearly got into this, and we're grateful for it because it's funny and goofy. It changes the tone, which is helpful. There's an awful lot of romantic tone here, and it's good to get a little jolt of satire from time to time. So yes, economical, but also in some points indulgent.
Yeah, and I mentioned too that that kind of dichotomy is actually really characteristic of modernism, where it's both like incredibly excessive and just like hugely long Dos Passos style, or it's about being really compressed, right? Just about being like having 2-line poems and compressing all of the meaning into as few words as possible, right? That's another hallmark of modernism, and I think, right, as Brian was saying, you can sort of see that here as well, right? This is a very short and compact novel, and it gets through everything. On the other hand, right, there are these kind of wild flights of lyricism as well, in terms of the language, that seem actually, in some ways, like not modernist. There's things that like people like Pound and Eliot would be like, no, you need to cut that. And so, right, I think that is also kind of appealing to a lot of readers, is that there is a kind of compression to the kind of meaning and to the length here, but Fitzgerald also allows himself these kinds of like sort of really kind of excessive romantic flights of fancy, or the kind of satirical thing that Brian was talking about, and those are both expressed in the novel.
And just a reminder for attendees, if you have a question or comment, you can submit it by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen and typing in your question or comment. So our next question comes from Scott. Who does the film version of Gatsby better, Robert Redford or Leonardo DiCaprio?
So glad that someone asked that question. I think the issue isn't Leonardo DiCaprio so much as Baz Luhrmann, because the fingerprints of his style are all over that adaptation, right? The 70s adaptation feels kind of generic and literally and figuratively pale, right? It's all in pastel. Baz Luhrmann goes for it. It's Baroque, it's over the top. And you might argue about which is truer to the spirit of Fitzgerald, but for sure the Baz Luhrmann is more fun to watch and fun to listen to, more diverse. He brings the Black people in who are not visible in the novel. I favor that one on the whole. Just one remark, though, is that both of them have the same almost fatal flaw, which is, unlike Fitzgerald, who knows better, they show the relationship renewed between Gatsby and Daisy. It's sort of the payoff of the whole story, right? Gatsby and Daisy get together. Fitzgerald knows that there's no way to show what goes on between them. It's like inconceivable, right? The dream is so extravagant. The woman is inadequate to measure up to that dream. How could this possibly work? So Fitzgerald, changes up. And it's at that point that he tells the backstory of Gatsby. He puts the backstory of Gatsby in place so that we don't notice that he's not telling us about Daisy and Gatsby together. In both of the movies, they relapse into a sort of corny montage of romantic moments between them. Soft focus in the case of the Robert Redford one, actually pretty soft focus in the case of the Baz Luhrmann too. But corny. Fitzgerald knew better, right? That's not going to work. I'm not going to be able to sell this. Let's change the subject. Let's talk about Jay Gatsby's past, which is completely out of order, right? Which tells you how important it was to him not to try and show us what their renewed relationship is like.
I confess to not having seen the movies, so I can't answer that. But in terms of what Brian was saying, I think it's also just in terms of Fitzgerald's style of not narrating that. The thing I was thinking about right now was Pride and Prejudice, another book that I teach a lot. Austen doesn't narrate like the moment of Darcy and Elizabeth getting together. That is like narrated, but you don't get people's speeches. And I feel like in those kinds of moments of sort of like grand romantic passion, it kind of works better to just not represent those and have sort of us as readers kind of fill those moments in, because whatever you wrote is not going to kind of live up to sort of our expectations, or in the case of Gatsby, like Gatsby's own expectations for what this event is going to be. So this kind of lets us sort of project our own feelings into those moments.
Just to give a little closure to this, let me read two sentences from a letter Scott Fitzgerald wrote to Edmund Wilson from Paris in 1925. The book had just come out, and Wilson was one of the great critics of that era, and a friend of his from Princeton. And Wilson evidently had said he liked the book. And Scott Fitzgerald writes to him, "The worst fault in it, I think, is a big fault. I gave no account and had no feeling about or knowledge of the emotional relations between Gatsby and Daisy from the time of their reunion to the catastrophe. However, the lack is so astutely concealed by the retrospect of Gatsby's past and by blankets of excellent prose that no one has noticed it, though everyone has felt the lack and called it by another name." That's true. That's true. He understood exactly, right? Astutely concealed. Exactly. Filmmakers should have learned from him.
Our next question comes from Ezra. Can you speak to the idea of self-disillusionment as key to the book's satire?
I mean,
I'm not sure I got anything, Jesse. You better start.
So I mean, obviously, so much about this is sort of is about Gatsby's illusions, which are so absurd. right, the idea that you can go back and just repeat the past, and the sort of building up of Daisy to these sort of insane heights, which, in a moment, right, Nick sort of remarks on how Gatsby has to adjust his expectations once he's confronted with an actual person, as opposed to the sort of product of his dreams. And so all of these are kind of sort of moments of kind of disillusionment. But I think, it's interesting in terms of its relationship to previous Bildungsromans or novels of development, which are often about a character losing their illusions, right? They have kind of illusions about life in the big city, and they go to the big city and they're kind of divested of those illusions about themselves and stuff. I feel like this just amps things up to a kind of absurd extent, where Gatsby is sort of all illusion. And that's sort of all he is. And I like, one of the moments that I like is his sort of timetable that he writes, that his father shows, which is this sort of just kind of pure aspiration and Ben Franklin-ish, how you should use your time, but it's also absurd. You couldn't possibly do that in a day. There's no time for basic things. And I think that does a nice job of capturing sort of how kind of grandiose, but also how kind of absurd Gatsby's illusions are.
I guess there's the issue of Nick too, and about how disillusioned he becomes. But that's complicated by the fact that he's, after all, writing after the fact. So there's a tone of disillusionment from the get-go, right? He tells the story as if, against his better judgment, he's attracted to Gatsby. He finds Gatsby fascinating. And it's partly because at the moment when he's writing the story, he already knows how the things fall out, right? So in a funny way, he's prevented the dynamic of disillusionment in his own storytelling.
It's interesting. One other little connection to Conrad that I noticed was that Nick calls Gatsby incorruptible at the beginning, which is an epithet that's used to describe a character in Conrad's Nostromo. Nostromo, in fact, is the character, and so right there's a sense in which there's something about Gatsby, or Nick wants to insist that there's something about Gatsby, something about his illusions in some way that makes him different and separable from everyone that surrounds him. And maybe it's the kind of origins or the kind of aspirations that he's putting into things, or maybe it's something about him and his character. But there is something that kind of, despite how absurd he can be at some points, right? Nick says that he's like a kid's fantasy of what a rich person would be. That there's still that very kind of innocence about this is something that is redeeming of him, as opposed to the characters that surround him.
Our next question comes from Susan. Fitzgerald reportedly went through many versions of the book. And she asked specifically, do you know if he shortened it in the process? But also if you want to just generally talk about what we know of the many versions that he went through.
I'm not in a good position to talk about that. I think, Jesse, if you know something more about it than I do, I'm not a textual scholar of Fitzgerald, so can't help much.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know about the sort of textual variations of it. I mean, I know there was there was a kind of large scale revision. I think he talked to an editor with an early draft, and then he kind of pretty substantially rewrote the novel. But I'm not familiar with the different versions.
To speak to sort of the time of Gatsby and then the popularity, Brian, that you discussed in the novel now, I know that initially this was not Fitzgerald's most popular work, and it wasn't particularly popular at first. I think there were a lot of copies from the initial printing or a second printing that sort of languished for a long time. Can you speak a little bit about the initial reception and perhaps how that's changed, or maybe why that might have changed, why you think that might have changed over time?
You're right, of course. Fitzgerald was confident that this was his best book, and really disappointed that it didn't do well. It didn't get good reviews. It didn't sell very well. His earlier books, the first two, were sold like hotcakes compared to Gatsby. And on the other hand, it's important to remember that he didn't actually make his living off of novels. He made his living off of short stories. He sold short stories to magazines to make ends meet, and that was a very successful side gig for him. So I think the rediscovery of Great Gatsby dates from after the Second World War. So, a decade after Fitzgerald was already dead. And it had a lot to do with modernist trained teachers in universities who recognized in the Great Gatsby a modernist text, and not just, social satire of the 1920s. And I think it was introduced into the canon in that era, in the 50s and 60s. It would be interesting to trace. I don't know well enough myself the sort of upward trajectory of its reputation in that era, but I'm sure that was the main driving force of its becoming hyper canonical.
I mean, I think in that way, right, Gatsby, I mean, although it's ascended to a height that's way more than the other books, right, it's very similar to how a lot of the sort of canonization processes of novels from that era occurred, right? This is really is the 40s and late 40s, early 50s, late 40s, 50s, early 60s, that where a sort of idea of modernism really emerges, right? That wasn't necessarily entirely a term that would have been used I mean, it was used at the time, but it wouldn't have been sort of considered a kind of field. And it's really with later kind of critics, the new critics in particular, who really kind of champion this as a kind of field of study and as a particularly sort of worthwhile. I mean, both sort of T.S. Eliot, like later as a critic, and then the new critics here. So a lot of these books get kind of championed in that time. And so it's interesting, like another instance is Moby Dick, of a book that by another writer who needed to sell copies of his book to make money and to make a living, and who was very confident that Moby Dick was his best book, but it didn't sell well enough. That's another book that starts to get championed with the rise of modernism because of its similarities to modernism in the teens and 20s, but then really gets institutionalized in the 40s and 50s, and with the sort of movement of modernism into the sort of the center of the canon. I also wonder the extent to which my dog is whimpering over here making noise. The extent to which this has something to do with with the sort of rise of kind of Cold War values, right? A lot of the kind of institutionalization of modernism as a field occurs because it's sort of being championed as being associated with kind of free expression. And so it's a thing that gets championed by like the CIA and by the State Department as an example of the kind of free aesthetic statements that you can do here that you couldn't do in Soviet Russia. And so, that may not be the main part of the reason why Gatsby gets championed, but I do think that it sort of coincides with those trends in the kind of academy and in literary studies.
And just for the record, the same pattern is followed by Faulkner's career, right? He's quite unsuccessful in the 20s and 30s and gets discovered in the 50s and 60s, partly because of an anthology of selections from Faulkner that gets everybody's attention and gets him introduced into classrooms, right? The big exception to this pattern is, of course, Hemingway, who was enormously popular in his time, and he was a friend of Fitzgerald's, and Fitzgerald was horribly envious of Hemingway's success.
Well, has added for anyone who is interested in the publication history or the revision history that there is a Cambridge University edition of Gatsby that has excellent analysis of the pre-publication changes to the novel. She's added that in. So we just have a few minutes left. So in these last few minutes, Brian and Jesse, if you'd like to offer any closing remarks, we've got a few minutes for you to do that.
So let's do it in the other order. You start, Jesse.
I don't know if I have any particularly closing remarks. I mean, I think, obviously I really enjoy reading Gatsby, and I think, part of the success too that Brian started talking about is that it's sort of domesticates some of the kind of innovations of modernism, right? It's taking all of these aspects and sort of aesthetic innovations and doing them in a slightly more accessible way and sort of wedding them to a plot that's really kind of stimulating and enjoyable. And that's why it is such a pleasure to teach both in high school and in college, because there's so much, right? The narrative structure, the symbolism, the themes are sort of really put kind of front and center. They're not things that you have to kind of dig through. And that can be a problem because I think people come in with a set expectation of what the book is about and what the book means. And as opposed to some more stylistically or formally challenging books where, people come in rather baffled and have to kind of piece together what this means. So that can be a kind of challenge, but it also just sort of accounts for the kind of accessibility of it that, right, these symbols, it's just very satisfying charting the symbols, like, oh, green light and other colors and other kinds of objects, right? They're very much right there for us to analyze, and that is quite accessible, right? It's like, versus I'm teaching to the lighthouse next week. And it's just like, you're not going to come up with like, what does the lighthouse mean? Like, that is not a question you can answer or that Wolf wants you to answer. But I feel like with Gatsby, like you can come up with some answers for what these things mean. And that's very, very satisfying, I think, for as readers.
And in my case, I want to say, I hope I didn't oversell the resentment line at the beginning here, because, at the end of the day, this is a little embarrassing for an English professor to say, it's really a beautiful book, right? It's beautiful. So, I have these nagging discontents from time to time, and especially since there are other beautiful books in the world. But, when you actually read it, and get into it, it gives you aesthetic pleasure. And, that's a good thing. And as they always say about books like this, every time you read it, you find something different. And, I go through it and I think, oh, why didn't I underline that passage, right? The last time I read it, because that's really great and really interesting. And, why didn't I notice this echo of some other writer the last time? So, it's one of those books. It's rich and it gives pleasure. That's really a good sales pitch, right, for a book.
Wonderful. Well, a big virtual round of applause to Brian and Jesse for sharing your time and expertise with us here today. And thank you so much to everyone who was able to join us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and your thoughtful questions. We've had a couple questions in the Q&A about when the next book club will be taking place. This is our final book club for this academic year, but in the coming days, we will be sending out a survey with asking for suggestions for our books for next academic year's book clubs. So please keep an eye on your email for that survey, and also keep an eye on the English department website and the College of Arts and Sciences website for next year's book clubs when those are posted. We'll also, in a separate email, be sending out a recording of this event in the next couple weeks. Everyone, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you for coming, and we will see you soon. Have a good one.